In this tutorial, we're going to model this toothpaste packaging. This is geared for people who are new to Blender who want to learn some package design. This is all about the little details that make the process work. So that's what we're going to do today, is we're going to focus on the modeling, and then we're going to focus on texturing and the UV mapping, and then rigging to allow the end to open up and be animated. So we're going to start off with the new scene, and we're going to use the default cube. Let's go ahead and select it, press the N key. It's pretty big, so let's take it down. I'm going to select all three fields, type in 6 inches to start with, and then just do a view frame selected. And then let's come down to the Y, which is sort of front to back. Let's make it 0.85 and then 1.25 inches. And that is the starting point for our toothpaste packaging. Let's go ahead and apply the scale. That's very important. So Command or Control A on the PC and apply scale. So it zeroes those out to 1.0. That's important. Press the Tab key. Let's come in and start dividing this up. We have symmetry, so we're only going to work on one half of it that will mirror. So let's come over to the loop cut function, click there and hit return, and then come over here and click one more time. I'm using a laptop, so I don't have a scroll wheel. You could use a scroll wheel to increase the number of cuts, but let's increase the number of cuts here to something like 7. And then I'm also going to add one more here that I'm going to slide just a little bit more closely. We're going to be doing some subtle forming to this with the lattice downstream, and I just wanted to make sure that I had enough divisions there. So let's come down here and click, and then increase this to 3 cuts, and do the same thing here, and then increase that to 3 cuts. So that is our starting point. Let's create the end flap now. So we'll come down here, let's switch over into face mode and just select all of these polygons, bring up the context menu, and then invoke the split function to separate them so that they become their own polygon island. Let's switch over into vertex mode now, hold the Shift key, click one of these back vertices and then reselect it again, white indicating that it's now the active element of all the selected elements. Press the period key and move the pivot point, which is this widget right there, to the active element's location. Then we can use the rotation function around the z-axis. Hold the Control key down so you can snap to 5-degree segments and get right to 90 degrees right there. Okay, now we need to weld these together. So I'm just going to do something really easy. I'm going to press the A key. All of these are pretty spaced apart in terms of their location relative to each other. So I can bring up the context menu and invoke merge vertices by distance. The default value will allow for 5 vertices, these here, to be welded together. So let's switch over into edge mode. Let's deselect everything. Double click an edge at the 4 corner location here. And what we need to do is put some geometry that will allow it to round a little bit. It's going to be pretty boxy, but we're still going to have some subtle roundness. So let's come over to the bevel tool, change it to a configuration of 2:1, and then just grab the little widget, pull out, and we're going to put some geometry about like that. That'll work pretty well. Now we need to come over to the back flap and extend this. It's created a polygon right here, so let's switch over into face mode, and let's go ahead and delete that face. We'll do the same thing on the bottom, although we're going to be doing symmetry. Shift-R will replicate that, so we don't specifically need to worry about it. In fact, we'll just worry about the top for right now. So let's come over here, take that edge that was created by the process, and do a dissolve edge function, making sure that dissolve vertices is activated. Now let's come over into vertex mode, press the K key. We're going to invoke the knife tool to continue this over. So click here and then press X to only go along the X-axis, and then click and return. Okay, so now let's come over here, select this edge, hold the Control key, click down here, and then we're going to extrude this out. So E key only along the y-axis, pull that out just a little ways like that. It's going to be a sort of a flap that helps to connect it to the interior. So we want to scale this up so that it actually tapers a little bit. So press the S key and then the Z key, but you can see it's scaling toward the active element. So let's undo that, press the period key, and we want the operational transform to be at the bounding box center of what we have selected. Press the S key again. We only want to scale along the Z axis, and now we can scale that down about like that. Since we have this edge selected, bring up the context menu and invoke the offset edge slide function. Just pull till you see that edge appear right there. Double click here, and then we're going to invoke the bevel tool, which I already have active, in this common 2-1 configuration that you'll see in subdivision surfaces, and we'll pull that out. And that will just produce a little bit of rounding right there when we subdivide it. So let's come over, close that down. We need to add a little bit of geometry. The folding is going to be right here. So I need to press Command R. In fact, you can see we've got an extra vertex down there, and so it's not going all the way. But again, we're going to be doing symmetry, so that's okay. I'm just going to pull that to that location right there. Click, Command R, and we'll do the same thing right there. Click. So when this gets folded at this line, the subdivision will have these tighter polygons to round into this larger area. So the next thing that we want to do is come over here and form these slightly so that there's a little bit of curvature. Let's look at this at the top. Let's remove perspective. Let's go into X-ray mode. And we're going to switch into vertex editing. And so we're in select box. So I'm going to marquee around these, and we'll pull these out just a little bit like this, because the natural box has this rounding to it. Everything is not perfectly flat. So we're going to pull this out like that. And then this middle one we'll pull out so that we have this rounding that naturally happens. Okay, and again, don't worry about what's happening right here. This is where you can come in, you can play with it, and you can decide if you want to maybe adjust it like that. That works pretty well. Okay, so the next thing that we need to do is take and scale this in just a little bit. If from our hinge point, we were to take this L form and rotate it down, it would interact exactly with the box, and we don't want that to happen. So I'm going to select all of these components here, and then hold the Shift key to select one vertex there, press the period key, and again, we're going to take the pivot point back to that location. So then we can actually go into scale mode, and I'm just going to do that by pressing S key, and along the X-axis, we're going to pull that in just a little bit. Not a lot, just a little bit, just enough to bring it inside. So let's rotate this now, and let's Option Z to go out of X-ray. Let's model the interior flap. So there's another flap here that comes to the interior. So let's model that. Come into edge mode and select these 4 edges. Press the E key and then X to constrain along the X-axis. Pull out, I don't know about that far, and then press Shift R to repeat that command. Now let's come over and switch over into vertex mode. Hold the Shift key, deselect that vertex, continuing to hold Shift key, reselect it. And since we're in pivot at active element location, the pivot automatically goes there. S key, Y constraint, and we'll pull that in about like that. Let's do the same thing over here. Double click, activate that element, and then S, and then Y, and we'll pull that in just a little bit, about like that. Okay, now let's come back over into edge mode, double click to select that edge loop, bring up the context menu, and then go down to the offset edge slide and just pull until you see that appear. Now let's do this center edge. We want this to be constrained, So when I was looking at a real package, it actually had this shape to it. And we don't want this to subtly curve. We want these to be fairly flat segments. So we'll switch back over here into our bevel tool with the 2-1 configuration and put bounding edges on either side of that. And that will function for us. Command R, and then we can just slide a new loop right about there and click. Now we need to add some constraint along here. Otherwise, when we subdivide it, it's going to be a little bit more rounded than I want. So this is where we're going to come back over, select this edge, hold the control key down, and select to that location, bring up the context menu, and again, do that offset edge slide. I haven't used this enough to memorize the keyboard command, but it is right there. So just pull that in about like that. Let's do the same thing over here. Control key, and then offset edge slide and pull that in. Now we need to connect this, and I want to constrain things a little bit here. So I'm going to press the K key, click here to here to anchor that loop, and then I'm going to come right here and put a new point. Let's come over and do the same thing on the other side. K key, anchor this to that location, and then bring that right there. And that just will make it so it's not super curvy coming in. It's a little bit more tightly controlled at that location. Let's come in and apply symmetry now. We've gotten all the data in that we need to run symmetry. So let's do this. Let's come over to our modifiers and add a symmetry via the mirror function. We're in edit mode, and we need to remember to activate it in edit mode by pressing that button. Now let's look at this along the x-axis, left to right. We want to make sure that we're mirroring only one half to the other side, and we can have the modifier remove the other geometry. So that's what the bisect function does. And notice when I do that, it's correctly lopping off geometry on this side and then only mirroring new geometry to that side. If you don't do that, it's just going to mirror both sides, and you're going to have overlapping geometry, and it's going to be a mess. Now we need to do top to bottom along the z-axis. So we come over to do z along with bisect z. And there we go. So now we have both sides set up. Now let's press the tab key, leave edit mode, and we're going to apply this because now we're going to be doing some basic UV mapping work. Let's jump back into edit mode now, and the camera gets in the way. That drives me nuts. Let's do this. Let's think about this from the standpoint of unwrapping it, because we're going to be applying a texture to it, and we need to have this box unwrapped as if you took the physical packaging and tore it open across one particular seam. So we're going to use this interior bottom as a seam edge. So we're in edge mode. Let's double click that down there, bring up the context menu, and then invoke the mark seam function. And when I deselect, you can see that that's a red color. So let's just step through the process of doing a basic unwrap on this. So we're going to come over into UV editing mode. Now you're going to notice something. I want to talk about this briefly. I have an add-on that automatically syncs up when I switch from one viewport to another. So if I switch back over to layout, in fact, I need to make sure and turn on whether I'm in edit mode or not. So when I switch back and forth between layout and UV edit, I have the same display going on. And I'll link you to that add-on. It's free and I absolutely love it. So now we need to unwrap this. And this is where we're going to get into a little bit of basic UV mapping. The first thing that we want to note is that when you're in the default mode here, you see all of our 3D geometry, but we don't see any corresponding UVs. If we come over down here to the data object properties, we can see that there's a UV map entry, and we have one UV map. Blender can have multiple UV maps per object. We're only going to use one, but we don't see any UVs. As you create geometry, UVs are created, but they're all collapsed to a single location. But the thing to note is that by default, Blender has two basic editing modes, and they're toggled on and off by this little icon up here in the corner. If I want to see what UVs are currently there, hover the mouse over the 3D editing environment, press the A key, and then you'll see that we in fact do have some built-in UVs there, but they're unusable. So this is where we come over to the UV menu in the 3D workspace, and we're just going to click Unwrap. And it does a really admirable job of creating very usable UVs because our object is pretty boxy. But we want to think about this for a minute. Our object has a physical size. We modeled it to that 6 by 0.85 by 1 1/4 inch size. And we're going to be designing a label in Illustrator and Photoshop, and we want to use those physical measurements to base our labeling off. Well, the UV space is an abstract space. It goes from 0 to 1 along the left, which is the U, and along the V direction, it goes from 0 to 1, and everything is a fractional value in between. It's an abstract space. So when we unwrap an object in there, we don't directly have a way of relating the size here to the physical size of the object, but we very specifically want to be able to do that. Let's come into the front view here for our 3D object, and we're going to figure out a way to give us a very specific size relationship that we can relate to the physical size of the object. Press Shift S to make sure that the cursor is at the world origin. That's very important for what we're about to do. Let's come back over here to the outliner. In fact, I'm going to call this package so it's named appropriately. And in fact, I'm going to press the Tab key to leave edit mode. I want to create a collection for this. We'll call this toothpaste and have that moved inside. So all of our objects are segregated into logical groupings. Okay, press Shift A. We could do this next operation inside or outside of edit mode. It doesn't matter. Shift A, and we're going to add a plane to the scene. Come down here to add plane. Let's make sure it is aligned to the view, so it's flat to the view. And let's make it 8.5 inches, which is a value in testing that I've found works for what we're going to be doing. So you can see that it is just a little bit larger than our object. Its bounds exceed the size of our physical object, just enough to give us some wiggle room, and that's what we want. Now let's select both of our objects, come into the front view. It's very important now to be in the front view. In fact, if you want to make sure you're in the front view, press the tilde key, and then you can very specifically make sure you're in front. Press the Tab key. We'll go into edit mode for both of the objects. What we want to do is regenerate the UVs completely, even though these look pretty good. So we're going to come up here to the UV menu, come down to Project from View, and specifically invoke the Bounds variant. And there we get projected UVs. So what we've done is we've created a relationship here between the UVs in the interior space and the bounds of the UV space itself. And that will allow us to generate a template that then we can set very specifically to an 8.5 by 8.5 inch template. So let's leave edit mode, Tab key, and we'll turn off the plane. We don't need that anymore. We'll come back over here and re-enter edit mode. Now, it's important to be aware that we're going to take a very brief look at the distinction here between these two modes. So the first thing that I want to do is pin some points to unwrap. And it's going to unwrap inside of this UV space that has the proper spatial relationship where we can now consider the UV space to be 8.5 inches by 8.5 inches, even though technically it's still a 0 to 1 and a 0 to 1 size internally. So let's come over and deselect everything. We want to be in face mode. And as soon as I see dots here, I know something. I know that we are in X-ray mode. And if I come over and I select these, it is selecting not only the front, but it's selecting the back. And I don't want that to happen. If I press A key, we can see all of these vertices being selected. But if I try and come over here, we're in vertex mode. If I try and come over and select here, it's selecting front and back facing vertices because these have been projected. So let's come over here and turn on the UV sync selection. Let's try that again. Let's come over here and select some of these. You can see when I select these, we're getting front and back facing, and I don't want that to happen. So let's come back over into the 3D environment and do the selection, but we need to have toggle X-ray turned off for that to happen. And then we'll just come in. I'm in face mode still. And we will select these front-facing polygons. And now only the front-facing are selected. We can come over here into our 3D environment. Now that we're in UV sync selection mode, see if I'm not in sync selection mode, we only see selected polygons. And that would only allow us to unwrap what is currently selected in the 3D environment. But we want to unwrap everything, so I need to be in the UV sync selection mode. Bring up the context menu, and we're going to specifically pin those points so the unwrap mechanism cannot move the island. It has to keep those in place. So now we press the A key to select everything in the UV space, bring up the context menu, and unwrap that, and there we go. So it's unwrapped around those pin points, and we maintain the correct relationship. I want this front-facing area to be aligned exactly halfway in the UV space. It's also aligned left to right in the UV space. So I'm going to select everything, and since we're here in the UV editor, let's come over to the UV menu and we'll do an export UV layout operation. This is where you could find where you want to save that, and in fact I'll just create a new folder here called links. Actually, we'll call it textures. Blender likes textures. So we're going to create this, and we want to come over for the size, and let's do 4096, and we'll just do all UVs. And then opacity, I'll take that up just a little bit. And then we will export the UV layout. And now we can come over to Photoshop and we can open those up. Let's come up here. Here we have the UVs. Click open. And there they are. So this is what we can use as a template. But importantly, we can come over to Photoshop now, come to image and then image size. And it's at 72 dpi, but we want to make it 8.5 inches. So make sure resample is turned off. So I type in 8.5 and it just reconfigures the document. So to get 8.5 inches, the resolution is 481, almost 482 pixels per inch. Click OK, and then we would save that, and that becomes the template that matches the physical size of our 3D object. Okay, so we're done with the UV mapping. Now that we've gotten that done, let's jump back over and finish some of the modeling. I'm going to come back to this other side. I'm going to press Option Z to leave X-ray. We want to fold up this side. We're going to animate the other side, but this side we want to have folded up. So let's come over here first, and we're in face mode. Double click that end, and then we're going to do a select more or less. And then, or you can just use the keyboard command to expand this up just before you get to that boundary. It can either come right up to this boundary or one loop before. Okay, and then let's go into vertex mode so that we can establish the rotation point. Hold the Shift key and select one point along this boundary. Again, let's come over to the rotation tool so that we can see that. And then we're going to rotate this, holding the Control key down, and I'm going to rotate it not so it's 90 degrees, but just maybe 110, just so it goes a little bit beyond. This is basically what the real packaging would do. So 100 degrees. So let's come and do the same thing down here. Expand out to that point, one key, select that single reference point, the active element, and then rotate that. So we're at 100 degrees. There we go. So we're just folding this size up. Let's do the same thing over here. Select that loop, expand selection out right to that point. In fact, we can come right to there. Vertex mode, select any of these boundaries, holding the shift key to select and deselect it so it becomes the active element. Let's do this in the top view so that we can rotate that. And I'm going to rotate it pretty close like that. In fact, we'll just do 100 or 90 degrees. Okay, so that's folded on that side. And if we look at it, you see we wanted to make sure that it came in just a little bit because we're going to be applying thickness to the object. But there's one other thing that we need to do right here is if you look, we've got it matched to this, to the top. We need to scale it down just a little bit. So let's zoom out. So I selected the very center vertex there, and that's good. I actually need to deselect one loop right here because we don't want it to go, we don't want that scaling to come right to here. So this is where we're just going to we'll just come over here and deselect these. Holding the shift key, I'm just going to quickly deselect those. Okay, but we need to be back in vertex mode. Take the S key and then Z and scale that down a little bit. I like to do a test to make sure my scaling is going to the center, which it is. Pull that down a little bit. Okay, there we go. So let's come back to the other side. Now, the other side, we're not going to fold up. We actually want the other side to be left as is because we're going to be doing some rigging on this side. Now let's go ahead and add a lattice to this because what we want to do is we want these perfectly flat surfaces to not be quite perfectly flat. When I was looking at the physical box of this, there's just a little bit of curvature here. So let's go ahead and replicate that. So tab to leave edit mode, make sure that we have the toothpaste collection selected, press Shift and A, and we're going to come down to a lattice. It's going to be really enormous. So let's take this down to 6 inches by 6 inches, just about like that. But we're only really going to want to be affecting sort of this internal area, but it's too big along the Z and through the Y. So let's do this. S key, Z, let's pop that down so it's pretty close. And then let's look at this along the X axis, S key, and then Y key. And we want to conform it so it's pretty close. It doesn't have to be absolutely exact. Okay. Now we need to configure the number of elements that we want to use. And so let's do this. Typically in Blender, you can select multiple elements like this and give them all a value that they'll all take on. But there is a bug here that won't allow that. So if I type in 3 here, it doesn't take. So let's do this. Let's come in here and add 3. And in fact, let's do 4. I think that'll work a little bit better. But along this direction, it says UVW. And frankly, I don't know how to relate UVW the way it is. So you just have to kind of guess. So let's come down to W. So I don't think that's the right one. V, nope, that's not the right one. It's U. So that we have to do. We just come in like this, increase the resolution about like that. So this is why early on, we added a little bit of extra resolution because I want to taper this. I kind of want the ends to still be flat, but I want the slight bulging to happen here at the centers. Let's come in and give this a name, the lattice more specific. We're going to call this package 1 lattice. Okay. In fact, let's name this package 1 because we're going to end up with 2 of them. So I'm just going to go sort of preemptively kind of start naming things. Now we need to come over to the package itself, the geometry, and we need to tie in that lattice. So we come over here to a modifier under deform. There we go. Let's add a lattice. This is a modifier that tells it to specifically attach itself to that lattice. Now we haven't deformed it yet, so let's come over here to the lattice itself, press the tab key, and we want to select, so I'm in select box, so We want to select the top, but we don't want to select the corners. So hold the Shift key, actually it's the Control key, sorry about that. Take the Control key to deselect those corners. Now let's do the same thing on the bottom. Since we can do this, we'll do it this way. And then the ends I don't want, so hold the Control key down and deselect the ends. So it's only those center vertices that we want selected. Let's look along the x-axis here. And in fact, I'm going to go into X-ray mode, press the S key and then the Z key, and we can pull those up to get just that little bit of that bulging curvature. Okay, so let's come over here and select these. You'll need to rotate then, holding the Control key to deselect those endpoints, because we want those to still be flat. Okay. These are a little bit difficult to see because of the way they're overlaid, but I want to make sure and get these turned off here. Control key. Okay, there we go. Now let's come back to that left view, S key, and then in this case, it's the Y-axis. We can pull those out to produce just that little bit of rounding. So that's why we put those extra loops in there from the beginning. Now, the cool thing about the way Blender handles this is it allows you to change the resolution of those segments. So if we wanted to come in, that's not the one I want. Let's do it this way. W, there we go. You could still increase it, and it kind of intelligently figures out that profile shape. And depending on the resolution of your mesh, you may need more or less. I think this is going to work fine, but it does exactly what I want. Is it just gives me a little bit of that curvature on our package. Tab key leaves edit mode, and there we go. So now we can come in and give it some thickness. So let's come over to our main object. We're going to start adding modifiers at this point. So we've got the lattice in there, obviously. In fact, let's also come on and turn on shade smooth, just so that we have the basic shading on. We're going to modify that in a minute, but we just want to have that turned on by default. Let's come over to the modifier, deform, actually generate. We want to give it solidify. It's going to be way too big. Let's put in a value that I found works, 0.006 inches, and we get just that little bit of thickness here. So we also need to apply a subdivision modifier. So let's come in, let's collapse these so we can see our modifiers. Let's come in and give it a subdivision surface modifier. It's put it at the bottom, and we're going to run into a problem here where it's subdividing around these thickened polygons, and we don't want that to happen. So what we do is we take the subdivision modifier. In fact, let me expand this out so it's clear, more clear. Move that above solidify. So it generates subdivision and then it solidifies it, which gives this nice hard boundary. In fact, if we come to subdivision, we can take the viewport level up to 2, and we can see that a little bit more clearly. But now we run into a situation where if we come over into shaded mode, we still have visible rounding here. And this is where we need to add the next modifier. We need to come in and come down to normal, do a smooth by angle. So finally it takes these last solidified polygons and it says, okay, we don't want to do smoothing around polygons that have larger angles than 30 degrees. And there's a 90-degree angle here, so it breaks the shading. Let's go ahead and set the material assignment up. We're going to let the Solidify modifier handle this for us, but we need to come down and actually apply a couple of material slots. We have a default one here, and we're going to just assign this. So I have the object selected, just so you know. You only see materials when you have objects selected. We're going to call this label. Let's change the color So it's really obvious what's happening. Let's switch over here into viewport shading. So it's really obvious what's happening right there. Now, if we want a separate material for the inside of the thickening of the thickness, we can set a material for that. We could also set a separate material for the thickness itself, but it's going to be paper. So we really just want one material. I'm going to create a new material slot, and then I'm going to create a new material for that slot. We will call this paper. I'm going to just come down here for right now and turn specular off. That's a material setting for later, but I'm there, so I'm going to do it. We'll go ahead and leave that to the base color of white. Now, currently, label has all the polygons assigned to it. Since it's on top, it overwrites paper from having any influence on the object. And we could manually come in, if we had access to all the thickened polygons, and manually tell it to assign interior polygons to paper and exterior polygons to label, but we're going to let the modifier handle that for us. So come down to Solidify, come down to Material, and where it says Material Offset, and Rim, give each of those a value of 1, like that. And that tells the material system to use label for the outside, and the 1 indicates one material below label to use for the thickness in the interior polygons. So that's how that works. It's nice. Once you know what that does, it's really quite easy. So this is the end of part 1. In part 2, we're going to add an IK chain for rigging it to allow you to animate the opening and closing. Then we're going to do a separate tutorial, part 3, where we're going to look at the actual material setup to get the metallic material and the labeling for the outside.